Hello, Catherine. How you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. I'm really glad to get you on because a lot's been going on, and I want to tell you a little anecdotal story. First of all, so we had an estate agent round our place. What was it? Not this weekend, just before the lockdown started in Melbourne, and just to get an appraisal because we're hoping to expand the family. Do we build or do we sell up and get a new property? We were talking away, and she made a comment which immediately made me think of you. She said, very nice lady. She said, "Oh, in where you live in Newport, um, it prices never go down." And I was like, okay, that's quite interesting. And then we had a lovely conversation, and then I asked her at the end of it, "Have you ever heard of the 18.6 year cycle?" Just out of interest, and she looked at me like, well, it was clear that she hadn't had a single knowledge, or she didn't know what it was. Do you know what I mean? What do you come across that a lot?
Yeah, I think
Real
that
estate?
is. No, it makes me laugh because, to be honest, that's how real estate agents are taught. I mean, real estate agent school is what, a week-long online course, and you can go into it not knowing English, like, and you come out the other end, and they kind of knight you as a real estate agent, and they give you permission then to go out and to value houses. And you don't know, if you have no knowledge of economics and no knowledge of even just the basic things of how the economy works, which I think that there's a fair few people out there that really don't, or at least only know what they hear on the media, then you live in this tiny little bubble. And particularly as a real estate agent, because you go into these areas where you are the real estate agent just of that little patch. That's your patch. And I've been here for 2 or 3 years now, and prices have never gone down. And so it doesn't kind of surprise me about it. I think this is one of the desires that I had within my own career, that well, I mean, obviously I work as a bar advocate, so I'm not just restricted to one patch, but it was really to get information out there that was accurate for people, so that we weren't all living in, a sub-reality.
Yeah, well, let's. So I was trawling back through your issues of cycles, trends, and forecasts, and here's something that you said on the 12th of March, 2020. So we've got to go back, right? Where it was at the very beginning of the COVID thing. The lockdowns were just starting to happen, and at that time, in that isolated point of time, we didn't know what was coming. And here's what you said. So, by the way, all the newspapers were end of the property, blah, blah, blah. There was a crash coming, people getting out of shares. There was going to be another 30%, 40% crash in the real estate market because there was no buyers or sellers. Here's what you said. You said, "It seems bleak out there currently with the COVID-19 outbreak. The current panic is forcing governments into urgent stimulatory measures. Both monetary and fiscal policies are being implemented. This will inevitably feed into land prices. This sets us up for an extraordinary anticipated real estate boom between 2021 and 2025. Now, this is why I kind of remember that when I was talking to the real estate agent. It's like, someone does know what's going on. What made you say that statement back then, knowing that, we faced it felt like a black hole, really?
Studied history, because had I not been aware of how the cycle works, and more so, that you can't, cycles exist within everywhere. So obviously you've got a lot of people that look at stock market cycles and everything else, but you can't just look at that. You need to have an understanding to understand the real estate cycle of the economics of land. And if you understand the economics of land, then you will see the importance of this cycle. And this is a cycle that really sits at the base of everything else, because we need land for everything that we do. We live on it, we eat from it, we work on it, we sleep on it. And land that is facilitated is short in supply. It's not something, I mean, if you get people wanting to buy shoes and prices start to go up of shoes, then someone else is going to come along and make more shoes, right? You can't do that with real estate, and there are other things that are short in supply within the economy. It's things that can be monopolized. So a study of history really gave us that knowledge that we were in fact, this was going to be, in terms of the real estate market, going sideways in price, maybe going a little bit backwards in price, but it was not going to be the real estate crash that everybody was predicting. And more than that, we were facing a phenomenal boom on the other side of it that was going to take us up into a peak around 2026, 2025, 2026. And at that point, that's when we would be looking at something that was more of a dire story, which of course is what Cycles, Trends and Forecasts is all about and what we write about in that edition. But to give the forecasters, the mainstream forecasters a little bit of leeway with that, if you do not know your history and you do not understand land economics, which I don't believe that you can do just by going through, economics university, on the ground, it did not look good.
I'm sure,
so I said that really just on the cycle.
That's one perspective you bring. You're on the ground every single day. But can we? I'd like to ask you where we are right now in the cycle and just expand on that a little bit more. But perhaps for the people that are maybe perhaps new to the idea of the 1860s, can you just explain exactly what it is?
Yeah, if you go back to around 1800 when America started to sell off its land, you can note an 18-year pattern where land would boom and bust in accordance with that cycle. So what you would get is you would normally get an upward trajectory in land prices. Within that cycle, you would get what we term, just in regard to land, because the recessions can be very bad or the recessions can be very mild, but you would get like a mid-cycle recession or a mid-cycle slowdown in the midst of that cycle, but it wouldn't crash land prices. And then you would get the second half of the cycle, which historically has been stronger than the first, although it does vary, on local areas. Like you can certainly, I'm talking very generally as to how the cycle works rather than just what happens in specific local areas. The second half of the cycle would be stronger than the first. And then because you would get the crash that comes at the end of that cycle. And that cycle is very consistent. In America, it can be traced back to the 1800s. Fred Harrison, UK economist, has traced it back to the 1600s in the UK. It's very clear that this is an important cycle that you need to understand if you're looking at land or you're interested in real estate. And there's very few occasions on which it has been interrupted. And one of those is where the world wars, obviously when you have a war and it takes people from speculating on land. And the second one is policy, because you can only evidence a cycle where you have speculation that is causing the prices to go up and therefore, causing the bust at the end of it. And so that's really how the 18-year cycle has been observed historically. In Australia, we haven't always seen a boom and bust every 18 years. We had a big bust in 1840, which was at the end of the 18-year cycle. We had one in 1890, which was the gold, evidence of all the gold boom that was pouring into land values. And then we had an absolutely magnificent depression that came at that point. And then, of course, we inflated a little bit into the 1930s, and then the Great Depression was at the end of the 18-year cycle. And then the last three cycles we have correlated with the 18-year cycle. And the reason is in Australia, we just haven't had, until that point, we've had policies that have actually pulled people away from speculating on land, such as a federal land tax, which we had in the early 1900s to around the mid 1900s, which discouraged people from hoarding land out of use. And, rent controls at various points. The 1890s bust was so bad that we didn't rise into the next cycle. So, for a long period in our history, you can't necessarily notice that land prices boomed and bust. So it's certainly on the, it doesn't mean that the 18-year cycle wasn't there. It's just that land has such a significant effect on the volatility of the booms and the busts within the economy that 18-year cycle is very significant where you live in areas where there is land speculation.
Why is it so difficult to then recognize the cycle then? Is it because each one just feels different? And so you don't, to the layman, you don't recognize it as a repeating pattern. Do you know what I mean? So for example, when COVID happened, you said on the ground, it looked terrible. It looked like the end of the world. It looked like the market was literally going to stop. But really, when you took a bird's eye view, it's like, it's just it's the cycle. What's that phrase you often say? It's history rhymes. It doesn't necessarily repeat exactly. Does that make it harder to tell when you're in it?
Correct. Yes. And also, cycles are not taught. You don't go to university to learn about cycles. Cycles is like natural medicine. It's seen as a pseudo occupation on the side. It's what people will learn if they become a stock trader, and they want to learn a little bit more, and then they will perhaps get into the study of cycles. But people, you never hear anybody from the RBA stand up and say, oh, well, we have this cycle, or it's to do with cycles. And I believe that to really understand this, you do need two prongs to understand it. It's looking at cycles and also understanding how the economy works underneath it. So it doesn't mean that you need to ignore fundamentals. It doesn't mean that the real estate market couldn't crash tomorrow. If the government could cause the real estate market to crash tomorrow by implementing true housing affordability policies, which take away speculation on land. And if you take away speculation on land and you don't have so many people rushing in to bid up the price of houses, and instead with the policies that you implement, you encourage them to work, then land prices will go down. And at some point, they will drop below the funds that have been loaned out in the bank, and you'll have a banking collapse. And that's one of the reasons that I believe that people will refuse to recognize that there is a cycle. It's far easier to keep people in the dark about how the economy works, real information about history, real news. And if people do dare to move their sights away from what they learn in universities, then they will start to see, and they study elsewhere, they'll start to see that there are these cycles, and they'll start to understand what the drivers are behind them. And by doing that, then that enables you to predict the economy. It's not magic. You don't have to be a magician to do it. You just have to be somebody that really does study and observe, and uses that in line with a knowledge of how economics actually works. And I believe that that's why people just don't see it, because they believe what they hear on ABC News or what they learn in their university courses. In the GFC, that was quite a significant point, because up until that point, most people have been in the dark around how the monetary system worked. They couldn't understand why we had a collapse that was, at that point again, the worst since the Great Depression. It started to come out that money was created and how the banking system actually worked. And it led university students at that point to say that they just wanted economics students to say they wanted to tear up their degrees because the paper that was written on was worthless, because that wasn't what they'd learned from their textbook, the university textbooks. And of course, people like Steve Keen, the Australian economist, who's now heading up university in the UK, Kingston in the UK. I mean, he was one of the few that came out very early on to talk about how the economy actually worked, and was pushed out of the system and relegated out of it because he spoke the truth about it.
Wasn't Steve Keen? I thought he was a real big property bear, wasn't he?
He was a property bear, so it wasn't so much that he studied cycles. But what Steve did, what he tried to do was to he wrote a famous book called Debunking Economics. And he was trying to tell people how the economy actually worked, because when he was in university, he was one of the very few to question what he was being told. And this is the problem with much of what we learn now. People are frightened to question it, because if they question it, they're immediately regarded as a conspiracy theorist or somebody that is going against the official information that they should know because they went to university. And unfortunately, universities don't have a good record of actually teaching people the truth of how things work. And that's why they can't forecast, therefore, when it comes to the economy. It's why they can't forecast the economy. And of course, we can, our discussion just before we started this recording, you can take that into other areas. But Steve King was one of the few. Michael Hudson is another economist in the US that has also came out all along and said, this isn't how the economy actually works. There's quite a few economists, but they're non-mainstream economists. They're kind of relegated to the side. But once you open your eyes and you look into this, then that's where you really start to learn. And you learn from a point of view that you can understand it. It's not difficult to understand. It's easy to understand because you witness it every day around you. And with the land market, that's the case. Once you start studying what impact land has on the overall economy, that's when the cycle clicks in and you realize that it's working. It's like clockwork around this 18-year cycle. And you can start to read the economy, not just read the economy, but read what the intentions are behind economic policies, because there are so many gains made in land. I mean, was it Thomas Piketty, where he wrote his book Capital in the 21st Century, and he came out and said, we need a wealth tax, right? So we just need to tax people's wealth. And he was trying to explain why some people were rich and some people, were not, put in the most simplistic terms, and what we needed to do to remedy that. And it was, I'm not taking away, it was a very good book, and there was a lot of good material within it, but it was a student at MIT University in the US that really went down granularly into the data and said, actually, most of those gains have gone towards landowners, because what you're taught in the university now is that we have capital gains on land. Your house has had so many capital gains, but in true economics, capital is man-made. So land was in effect was written out of the university textbooks. So they call it capital gains, but it's not. It's land price inflation, because the house depreciates on the land, and it's the land that appreciates. And so he was saying that it's the people that have monopolized land, that have monopolized, whether it not just in residentially, but whether you're looking at farmland or whether you're looking at land that produces the materials that we need for energy. Right. So it's people that monopolize these things of where the wealth has flowed to. And from the policies in this country that the policies, if you are a renter in this country, you come at the bottom of the pile and you will die poor. The policies in this country are all formed around you owning your own home by retirement, you having a home. And the reason that we work is to pay off our mortgage, and the whole notion that buying the house is as important as getting married and having kids and providing that home, it becomes as important as it. And so the policies of the country push people in this direction. You talk to people on the street that say to you, in periods like we've had now, I mean, I can, even over the last few months, so just to give you an example, because I don't think people truly realize how much money is being made in the real estate market. But I know people that bought at the end of last year, so we're only talking a few months ago, and they would have paid around 1.1 million for land, and now that block of land now would be worth around 1.3 to 1.4 million in just a few months. And so quite often in these periods of a boom market, and we've had them before, but this is quite unique in what's happening in this cycle. It's quite phenomenal what we're seeing at the moment. But it's where people will say to you, my house, my property earned more than I earn at work. And how did it earn it? It wasn't through them working. As the John Mill, the classical economist, said, they grow rich in their sleep without working or economizing. This is a lottery win for a lot of people, and they don't want that ever to change. And so whilst that system exists, we have a cycle. And if you acknowledge the cycle, and if you say, yes, this is going to cause devastation on a level that COVID causes it, because when we have an economic collapse, and this happened in 2008, you look at the suicide figures and the people that lose all their fortunes and the distress and the illness that it causes mentally and physically to people to have that kind of downturn and collapse, particularly in the housing market, because it affects poor and rich alike, unlike the dot-com bubble where it's the people that invest in stocks, but the housing market where everyone's been pulled into it and you have that collapse. That's absolutely destructive. So to recognize a cycle, you have to recognize that is what is ahead and the timing of when that is coming. And then you have no choice, if you are a responsible government, than to say, we want to change the policies of this country to ensure that never happens again, and we create a country and society where everybody can be prosperous. We will remove taxes from income and productivity, which damage the economy because they cause deadweight losses, and instead will tax away what you don't earn, your land price inflation, of which would encourage building activity and stop people hoarding land for gain. That would be the way to move the economy away from what we have now, which is an 18-year cycle. But as we know, it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. So you have to recognize what is happening if you want to be personally responsible with your finances and your future, right? When you see all this insane stimulus, you mentioned 2008, where you said the collapse then was the biggest since the Great Depression. It feels like there's heaps more at stake now. I mean, the stimulus is just unfathomable, basically, isn't it? Is this all playing into this blow off top that you expect in 2025, 26?
Yeah, and I believe that it's going to be a really severe collapse because nobody will see it coming this time, because everyone will say, well, particularly in terms of the Australian housing market, well, if COVID couldn't do it. And as we know, it's important to understand that the government, to an extent, has control when we get to those collapse points. But there's only so far you can push it. So we saw the stimulus obviously go in 2008. Now, I remember 2008 because I was working for another company at that point. I wasn't running my own business. And we lost all our buyers straight away in 2008. There were many real estate agencies that went out of business and couldn't generate income. We were on the precipice of an absolute collapse. And I think it was in Swan's biography of that time where he had a conversation with Paulson in the US, he said, what should I do? And he basically said, throw everything at the housing market, because if you can stop the housing market collapsing, you'll be okay. And of course, that was why those policies were implemented at the time. Right now, we're seeing a little bit of the same. You could obviously, we went through the period where the banks were giving mortgage holidays, and so it was preventing people that might have sold at that time selling. Yep. But the banks are never in a position to do that at the end of the cycle. If they're going to do that, they're in a really good position to do that mid-cycle, right? At the end of the cycle, historically, you always see that there has been an exponential increase in mortgage fraud, that the disasters of any housing collapse have been completely forgotten. People can't remember it happening. In Australia, we never had a housing collapse, like your estate agent said to you. Yeah. No, the prices have never gone down.
To be fair, so she said they did go down. Well, it depends. There was a period, and she referred to 2008, where if you had to sell, if your circumstances meant that you had to sell, it would have been really bad. But other than that, it just goes up.
Yeah, and I think it's important to also note that 2008, we were on the upswing of a commodity boom, which also has a cycle. And so that kind of did play into supporting things for us to an extent. And we're also a very small nation. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the policies that were implemented at that time kind of stopped that trigger point occurring. But if you go back 18 years from 2008, and let's put the cycle to test, you get back to 1991, the early 1990s, where the housing collapse was really extremely severe. And it's not so easy to research what was happening on the ground at that time because we didn't have social media. You have to go back into the archives and read the newspapers or talk to the real estate agents that lived through that time, where they couldn't sell, they couldn't drop prices low enough to get sales. Very similar to, the places that did obviously have the collapse at the end of around 2008. I mean, if you go into the Perth mining towns, they still haven't recovered. They're still underwater, and there's still properties that are around that. So, and that's what America suffered. But the early 1990s, Melbourne prices it took 7 years for them to start going up. Anywhere, and the city was vacated. It was a terrible time, So if you wanted to sell, you couldn't sell, and if somebody wanted to buy, they couldn't buy because the banks at that point don't lend. So you can, to even borrow to go into the housing market at that point is extremely difficult, and they're very cautious about lending to anything at that point because if you can't pay the mortgage, then the valuation, they're not going to be able to flog it off in a market that is flooded with property anyway. So, and then 18 years back from that, you get to what was termed the OPEC crisis, but of course was actually a housing collapse as well. It was a housing-led crisis. They always term these things, try and delude you as to how it was. But depressions are always said to be the worst since, recessions are the worst since the Great Depression. But if you go back 100 years to 1920, 1921, was what was termed the lost depression. I'm sure you've heard of it, Woody. But the lost depression was worse than the Great Depression. It wasn't a housing collapse. That's why it didn't last as long, and it wasn't as devastatingly terrible, on everybody. There hadn't been so much real estate speculation into the lead up when people were coming back from war. But this is very similar, but it followed shutdowns to the same scale that we saw this time. And so if you research that bit of history, even though, as you say, history doesn't repeat, it rhymes, even though the circumstances aren't exactly the same for what produced the depression or how the economy works, and we have far more private debt than people did then. The roaring 1920s has a lot.
That's what followed.
Correct. And it wasn't a Wall Street, the press term it as a Wall Street bubble, but it was a land price bubble. The money from Wall Street flowed into the land market, and you saw exponential increase in land prices, termed the Florida bubble, really, if you want to look it up on Wikipedia, because there was a massive influx into the subdivisions of land in Florida. But the land prices in Manhattan was an unbelievable boom in Manhattan of building activity. The land prices went berserk. I can't remember the exact. I actually just written an article on it for the Daily Reckoning, but I can't remember the exact percentage that I put on there. But it was really quite phenomenal, and that
culminated in the Empire State Building, didn't it? Which I believe remained empty largely empty, didn't it, for the next 10, 15 years?
Correct. It was opened and termed the empty. It was coined in by the people as the empty state, because it had offices and office stock. The amount of offices had increased tremendously in the area, and so people just couldn't afford the rents, and it just remained empty and took a long time, marking the peak of the cycle. But that's exactly what we're seeing now. It's precisely that, money, the stock market going crazy. Money is worth nothing now. Obviously, there's, slightly different drivers to it, but it's the same. Everybody can become a millionaire. Everyone can get rich quick from the crypto that's going on. There are kids, the real estate agent, friend of mine who was telling me a story about a first home buyer that had used his winnings on crypto to buy a property. There's a tremendous amounts of money that are being made at the moment from speculation. And so you can't help but just think, this is where your knowledge of history can really kind of support what you're seeing now and help you understand why we're seeing remarkable inflation in some areas of the economy, whilst we have record low rates and the fundamentals of what is happening now, to help you understand that even though prices seem incredibly high,
they can go higher.
They're going to be a lot higher. And people will look back today, as you look back to last year, and as you look back to 2017, when we were at a peak in 2017, and you say, well, prices were really high then, and yet now they don't look high.
I know one of the indicators that uses, we mentioned the Empire State Building. It tends to be the tallest. That's another indicator that we're coming up to the peak of the cycle, right? Is that the tallest buildings start getting unleashed. And I think you listed in one of your issues, like, I can't remember whether it was the Real Estate Wealth Alert or whether it was the Cycles, Trends and Forecasts, where you listed a number of tall buildings, the tallest in whatever city or country, and loads of them are going to be built and unveiled in 2026.
Yes, so this is really to do with a lot of easy money sloshing around in the economy, and it's your great indicator, because tall buildings are not economical, right? So they take a massive amount of money to build, because it's not easy to get things from the ground to the top. And then you're really relying on future contracts. So just as it was the case with the building that's just been built constructed in Melbourne, Australia 108, I think it is, where they we're building effectively into a downturn, because it takes 5-6 years sometimes to go through the process of getting the permits and to do the construction, and you get it in good times where there's money sloshing around and the economy is looking great, and you think that you're going to rent them out, and you sell these properties off the plan. And unfortunately, they tend to open up in the downturns where people can't, where the valuers can no longer establish that what you paid for it is what it's worth, and then buyers can't go through with the contracts. But when I say they tend to, I have done a study on this, and it's empirical, that the tallest in the world is inevitably opens in a downturn. And you can go back and look at that yourself. And because you can see similar patterns, really it's the construction cycle. You can see similar patterns in construction of large pieces of infrastructure, because it really is when, like I said, when there's a lot of money sloshing around, and because it's a long-term project, that's why you get it opening in the downturns, or why it signifies that it's the peak. So to bear in mind that it opens in the downturn, right? Or as you go, it's hard to kind of completely accurately pin the peak, which we do, by the way, in Cycles, Trends and Forecasts. We do in some of those editions pin the actual peak for people that are interested.
Well, I've got so many questions, but I'm conscious of the time. But the one thing I want to say is that you paint, it could be interpreted as being quite a doomsday kind of view, but it's actually not if you understand what's going on, right? So obviously 2026, that's the year that you're marking as the peak in the new cycle, the cycle that we're currently in. What do you advise? How do you position yourself to take advantage of this cycle? I mean, so we're in 2021 now. We've got another 5 years to go, right? Is this the time to be accumulating land, property, or what do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, when we're talking about a peak, it's actually quite hard to indicate the exact peak of wherever you live, right? Because the peak, what happens in Brisbane, won't necessarily be the peak that happens in Melbourne. Right. But certainly the peak as it is seen on the equity market, on the stock market, you can be a lot more accurate around when that is, because it's a reactionary sell-off. You need to remember, with real estate, people are selling for all different reasons. So the downturn takes a lot longer. Sorry, say that again.
And it's also there's a slight delay, so apologies if I'm talking over sometimes. But it's a lot easier to get out of a stock than it is, say, a house, right? It takes a lot.
Correct. And owners who are in the dark about what's going on at the time. I mean, just like they did actually in 2018, because that was that was a downturn. It wasn't a crash. You can only have a crash where there's a mass group of people that sell, right? And there's just a flood of property that hits the market, which didn't happen in 2018 so much. People tried to hold on, and then they were, not sure what was going to happen. And, and we didn't see the upturn, obviously, until all the Royal Commission was out the way and the election came in, and then whoosh, the market went up. So we're actually talking about a crash here, but you're absolutely right. Some vendors will hold on and hope, and then others will want to get out, will have to get out quick because they will have lost their jobs. But what people should be doing now is accumulating and exposing themselves to land, whether that be through direct ownership of land, whether that be through direct ownership or development of land, or investing in a REIT, for example, an REIT, or the stocks that back the land cycle, and having a knowledge of that cycle and where it's going to go. That is the way that you accumulate wealth, because it is a very powerful component of the economic choreography, as I explained. So it affects every other area of our economy, because land is effectively, accessible land is effectively short in supply. It's where the money ends up, because it's worth what the bank will lend. It's worth what people have in their bank account. And people will always, the value of location is incredibly important, not just from an income earning aspect, but also from a health aspect. So people will always compete to bid up the price of well-located land. And that's the cycle that you are speculating in. And because they bid up the price, we know that it has to have an end date. At some point, it can't go any further. We are effectively producing a bubble in the land market. But once you understand how the cycle works and you understand the timing of it and you are sure about it inside of yourself, then there are many opportunities to make significant wealth out of this cycle. And the reason I say that is because policy is not going to change anytime soon to stop this. It's going to push us into the biggest boom that we have ever seen, and potentially the biggest downturn as well at the end of this. So you have a few years to really take advantage of that, and they shouldn't be wasted.
And finally, I think where the real risk though is I know that when you look at the cycle, it's that you always identify a period towards the end which you call the winner's curse. That's where you don't want to be exposed.
Yeah, correct. The winner's curse terminology came from Fred Harrison, who I would encourage anybody to look up. He was the person really that brought the 18-year cycle to popularity in the UK. Yeah. And he did a study of the UK market, and then with a desire to change economics. And he termed from his study that there was this 2-year period at the end of the cycle termed the winner's curse, which you can witness in some areas around the world, where you get this period of just frantic speculation. Throw your hat to the wind because people just are at that point. And I remember that back in 2007, particularly in Australia, because it was actually quite similar, to stories that you will hear today, except it was at the end of the cycle. So we'd gone up, from the dot-com bubble and the 9/11 and all the events that happened around that pushed the economy into recession and uncertainty. And we were on our way up. And in 2007, you were seeing people that bought in December and could sell a couple of months later and get their stamp duty back and all their sales cost back in a profit.
Yeah.
Sorry, because the market was going so crazy. And that's effectively the winner's curse. And what you would also see around that time is interest rates rising, because that's the point where the economy's gone through enough recovery, focused on slowing down the housing market. The interest rates rise, and so the lending rates, the banks shift up their lending rates. And at that point, for example, in 2007, in contrast to what we have today, lending rates were around 9-10% in some circumstances. And at some point, so much speculation has gone into land that it has eroded the productive sectors of the economy away. It's caused all the destruction of having faulty foundations that are going to collapse as soon as the bubble is effectively popped. And it's popped without people seeing it. If you're not aware of this cycle, you will not see it coming, just as it happened in 2008 with suddenly wham. And just actually as it's happened now with this one. You don't see it coming. It's out the blue. It comes out the blue. Why is that happening? Because everything was going so well. So it's incredibly important, even if you are not thinking of investing in land, even if you want to understand investments in other areas, to be very aware of this cycle, because this cycle will assist your timing in other investments also.
It'll also help you to sleep a little bit better at night, because you kind of know what's going on. I mean, I consider myself very, very lucky to be the publisher of a company where we have all these conversations, and we have people such as yourself, such an expert on these things, and it just allows you to think more calmly about your financial plan, really.
Correct. Yes, and absolutely, particularly at this time, because I think that there's even though we are now, into this what's been termed as a V-shaped recovery, there's a lot of people that are still struggling and really don't understand, and are very naturally very, very wary when they look at the housing market and what's going on the ground. Now, to be clear, it doesn't mean that you can't have pullbacks. It doesn't mean that there can't be certain things that affect different areas. That's the kind of granular information you need to get into. The cycle is like your overall roadmap, so that you understand the timing of where things are going. And then what you need to do is you need to understand then where to put your money. Just to give a brief example, I know we've been talking for a long time, but between the housing market and the apartment market, for example, we're talking about, this is a land price cycle, right? And apartments in Australia, we're oversupplied on them. And at the moment, they are not seeing a massive boom. In fact, if anything, their prices on many of them are going backwards for many reasons. So if you think, okay, that's great, I'm going to go and invest in the real estate cycle and I'll buy an apartment, you're probably not going to do very well, and you wouldn't be very happy with me for encouraging you to invest in the real estate cycle. So you need to have a little bit of knowledge. But this, in terms of where the downturns come, this is what we are talking about within cycles, trends, and forecasts. And obviously, the other product that I write, the Real Estate Wealth, gives you a little bit more information if you want to directly invest in real estate. But that's what we're talking about in cycles, trends, and forecasts, how you can take advantage of this cycle.
Fascinating stuff, Catherine. I'm going to wrap it up there because we've been, like you said, been talking a long time. I've got maybe we'll catch up again next week, and we'll also bring Callum, and maybe we'll extend the conversations with Freeway a bit, and he can give us his take on the stock market side of things. But yeah, like Catherine says, if you want to check out cycles, trends, and forecasts, I really recommend everyone does it if you haven't already. Catherine, thanks so much for your time. It's been a fascinating conversation.
You're welcome. Thanks, Woody. Good to talk.